Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, February 1st, 2022. President Joe Biden meeting with the chairman and ranking Republican of the Senate Judiciary Committee in the Oval Office of the White House, discussing the impending Supreme Court vacancy and selection of a nominee to replace retiring Justice Stephen Breyer. President Biden has already said that he plans to choose a black woman. Today, he added more about the judicial philosophy and other criteria he's looking for, and he promises to consult regularly with the senators. The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell says he does not support shortening sentences of anybody who has pled guilty to crimes related to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Senator McConnell asked about former President Donald Trump's suggestion that the rioters be pardoned. Russian President Vladimir Putin accusing the U.S. and NATO of ignoring Russia's security concerns as the Russian threat of a military invasion of Ukraine still looms. And a pair of confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill for President Biden's nominee to lead the White House Budget Office, officially the Office of Management and Budget. That's an office that has not had a permanent director since the Biden administration began. CNN reports Tuesday afternoon the White House is poised to select former Alabama Senator Doug Jones to guide the Supreme Court nominee through the confirmation process on Capitol Hill. Two people familiar with the process tell CNN, filling the role known around Washington as Sherpa. Jones, a longtime federal prosecutor who is best known for bringing members of the Ku Klux Klan to justice, is a longtime friend and ally of President Joe Biden. He was on hand in Atlanta during the president's voting rights speech late last month and is in frequent communication with the White House. The White House and Jones declined to comment. Well, CNN filed that story just as President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris were meeting with the Senate Judiciary Committee chair, Democrat Dick Durbin, and the committee's top Republican, Chuck Grassley, in the White House Oval Office, talking about the vacancy. The president made some remarks.
We're out there in the cold too long, folks. Look, I invited, we're different parties, but two good friends down here. We've done an awful lot of Supreme Court justices together, Senator Grassley and I, as well as Senator Durbin. And we've worked together in a lot of court nominations overall, but particularly Supreme Court nominees. And selecting the justice is one of the president's most serious responsibilities. And as I always said, I went back and looked at a lot of the opening statements I made. Apparently, Dick, I've presided over more Supreme Court justices than anybody around who's still in Congress or associated with the government, which is kind of means we must be beyond 60, Chuck. I'm not sure what it is, but we're a little older.
For me, it'd be 15 or 16.
Yeah, well, and I started way back early on, in the early 70s. At any rate, what we're going to do is, I've said before, and I went back and looked at some of the opening statements I made from justices over the years, that, you know, the Constitution says advise and consent, advice and consent. And I'm serious when I say it, that I want the advice of the Senate as well as the consent, if we can arrive on who the nominee should be. And, you know, there's always a renewed national debate every time we nominate, any president nominates a justice, because the Constitution is always evolving slightly in terms of additional rights or curtailing rights, et cetera, and it's always an issue. And there's several schools of thought in terms of judicial philosophy, and we'll see. But the fact is that I'm looking for someone who I can, this is not a static issue, it flows back and forth. What I'm looking for is a candidate with character, with the qualities of a judge in terms of being courteous to the folks before them and treating people with respect, as well as a judicial philosophy that is more one that suggests that there are unenumerated rights in the Constitution, and all the amendments mean something, including the 9th Amendment. And but I intend to take this decision, make this decision, and get it to my colleagues by the end of the month. That's my hope. And I'm looking forward to their advice and how to proceed and how the hearings will be conducted and the like. So thank you very much. We're going to get a chance to talk. I want to hear from them today. Thank you.
President Biden in the White House Oval Office, not taking any reporters' questions. He was joined by Vice President Kamala Harris and the leaders of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Democratic Chair Dick Durbin of Illinois, the ranking Republican on the committee, Chuck Grassley of Iowa. The news outlet Politico asked several Senate Republicans what they thought of the president's promise to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court. Senator Grassley's response was, he can set any standards he wants, but I don't want to look at this, not whether it's man, woman, black, white, whatever. I'm looking at people that will interpret the law, not make the law. That's my job. And those sorts of things are more fundamental than anything else. Here's the view of another Senate Republican on the Judiciary Committee, Ted Cruz of Texas. He spoke with reporters on Capitol Hill.
Senator, you made a particularly provocative statement about if you're a white man, tough luck, and African-American women should be insulted by the president's statement he's going to nominate an African-American woman. Can you understand why some people find that objectionable?
No, because you got to understand, racial discrimination is wrong. Period, full stop. One of the most depressing things about Democrats today, they're very comfortable discriminating based on race. We just finished a hearing where one of Joe Biden's judicial nominees has argued that Asian Americans, to be sufficiently woke, must support racial discrimination against Asian Americans. The Democratic Party supports racial discrimination. It is wrong to discriminate based on race. And when Joe Biden throws out a quota that the only people he will consider for this nomination are African American women, he is, number one, rejecting, regardless of merits, everybody else, whether they are white or black or Hispanic or Native American. He's saying nobody else, doesn't matter your credentials, doesn't matter your background, doesn't matter who you are. I, Joe Biden, will discriminate based on race. It would obviously be wrong if a president said they were going to nominate a white woman or a white man. You and I would both agree that's wrong. But in this instance, the Democrats are so casually racist that they'll make that promise. And not only that, it ends up being insulting to African American women. There are black women who are very talented jurists who may well be the appropriate nominee, but when Biden starts out by saying he has a quota system, he diminishes the achievements of those African American women.
Senator Ted Cruz, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Republican, speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill. The Judiciary Committee will be the first stop for the nominee. If the committee approves whoever is nominated by President Biden to the Supreme Court, it heads to the full Senate. Democrats there have the slimmest possible majority, 50 seats out of 50. So Vice President Kamala Harris breaks the tie as president of the Senate in favor of the Democrats. So if all the Democrats do hold together, they can confirm a Supreme Court nominee without any Republican votes if it comes to that. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, today commending President Biden for deciding to select a black woman to the high court and promising a fair and quick confirmation process.
With Justice Breyer's decision to retire at the end of this term, President Biden has an opportunity to make the Supreme Court look more like America by nominating the first black woman in U.S. history to serve as a justice. We have had 115 justices in the history of this country. Only 5 have been women, only 2 have been African American, none have been African American women. So this is simply having the court reflect America, which it hasn't in the past. Until, I believe it is 40 or 50 years ago, there were only white males on the bench on the Supreme Court. So America changes and evolves and moves, and so should the Supreme Court. So what President Biden said is a good idea. Now, the Senate will have a fair process that moves quickly to confirm the president's pick. I applaud President Biden's commitment to choosing a qualified and a historic nominee. A more balanced, more diverse judiciary has been one of our top goals ever since we got into the majority a year ago. And we are achieving that, and now we will achieve that, hopefully, at the Supreme Court level as well. The more Americans look at our courts and see people who look like them and come from the same backgrounds and share similar experiences, the better off our justice system and our democracy will be.
The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, part of his opening statement at a Senate Democratic Leaders News Conference. He was joined by other members of the leadership. And as this process unfolds, you can follow it on C-SPAN radio, C-SPAN television at cspan.org, and the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. From NBC News, more than a dozen historically black colleges and universities received bomb threats on Tuesday, the first day of Black History Month. Howard University was among the first to issue a shelter-in-place order early Tuesday, just a day after the school and several other historically black colleges and universities received similar threats. An all-clear was later issued for Howard following a probe. The FBI says it is investigating. At today's White House briefing, question to the Press Secretary Jen Psaki about whether more should be done.
There is a historic issue when it comes to bomb threats in the black community. And with that said, you have people like Lee Merrick calling it terrorism, and he's asking for the DOJ, Homeland Security, and U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate, to form a task force, particularly specifically on these issues. Is there talk around the White House for this to happen?
Well, what I can tell you, April, is that we take these threats incredibly seriously. That, again, our Homeland Security advisor is in close touch with law enforcement authorities at a federal and local level, and we are assessing what we think the origin, the reasoning, the motivation behind it is. We don't have an assessment of that quite yet, and I don't want to get ahead of that process, but we absolutely are behind these HBCUs. We are want to make very clear that we take these threats seriously and we deeply value their contributions, but it's important for law enforcement authorities and others to make an assessment before we make any determinations about next steps.
Does the White House see the irony in this moment with these continued bomb threats of HBCUs, particularly as much of the power structure up and down Pennsylvania Avenue are graduates of HBCUs, starting with the Vice President, Howard University, Cedric Richmond Morehouse, Joyce Beatty, the head of the CBC, Central State, the House Whip, James Clyburn, South Carolina State. So is there irony in this moment?
I'm not sure I would call it irony, April, but I would say that it is scary, it is horrifying, it is terrible that these students, these faculty, these institutions are feeling under threat. Now, again, we don't know more details at this point in time, and I don't want to get ahead of law enforcement authorities, but certainly, given the history you referenced, this is something we're very mindful of, and that is why we're so focused on providing regular updates and seeing what our law enforcement team assesses.
The White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. Questions from April Ryan, White House correspondent for The Griot. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona tweeting today, our historically black colleges and universities have again been targets of disturbing threats. My team will continue to work with students, faculty, and alumni to make sure HBCUs continue to be a safe place for students to learn. Threats of violence will not be tolerated, period. That tweet from the Education Secretary. The U.S. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell asked today about former President Donald Trump's suggestion that if he runs for president, that is, Trump runs for president in 2024 and wins, he may pardon those who face charges in the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. That violent assault by Trump supporters looking to prevent Congress from completing the constitutional duty of counting the presidential electoral votes that showed Joe Biden the winner. Here's the question to Senator McConnell.
How concerned are you about the former president offering pardons to people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th? And because of his comments, does he have the moral authority to be president again?
Well, I can speak for myself. The election of 2020 was decided December the 14th of 2020 when the Electoral College certified the winner of the election. What we saw here on January the 6th was an effort to prevent the peaceful transfer of power from one administration to another, which had never happened before in our country. 165 people have pleaded guilty to criminal behavior. None of the trials have been finished yet, but 165 have pleaded guilty to criminal behavior. My view is I would not be in favor of shortening any of the sentences for any of the people who pleaded guilty to crimes.
Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the minority leader, with reporters. CNN has a story. Greg Jacob, a top aide to former Vice President Mike Pence, met with the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th riot on Tuesday. CNN spotted Jacob leaving a meeting room on Capitol Hill used by the committee to conduct witness interviews. A source familiar with the matter confirmed he was scheduled to appear before the panel on Tuesday. Jacob's meeting with the committee comes after CNN first reported that Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short, sat for an interview last week. The Senate Judiciary Committee Chair, Democrat Dick Durbin, asked today as well about former President Trump's offer to possibly pardon the rioters if he wins the presidency again. Reporters starting out, though, on a different issue. A post-January 6th attack reform unveiled today that Durbin and other Senate Democrats are proposing to amend the election law from 1887 called the Electoral Count Act to clarify that the vice president's role overseeing the formal counting of the Electoral College vote is ceremonial. You might remember that President Trump tried to get former Vice President Mike Pence to throw out the results of states he lost. And the reform proposed today also making it harder for Congress to object to a state's slate of electors. Here's Senator Dick Durbin.
Senator, you put out a discussion draft today on the Electoral Count Act.
Yes.
Why did you put that out now? You know, there's also these parallel bipartisan discussions going on. How do you see those?
I want to see where we have a common ground. I'd like to put together a bipartisan approach to this. We're trying to protect the integrity of the Electoral College vote for the very reason I mentioned earlier. The January 6th assault on the Capitol by these insurrectionists was an attempt to interrupt this process. The House committee finding last week that there were some alternative false slates being created, I mean, that is serious. As far as I'm concerned, that's as close as it comes to insurrection and treason.
And you directly address that in this discussion draft?
We do, in several different aspects, but I'm open to suggestions from the bipartisan group, too. It would be terrific if we could come to a common agreement.
Former President Trump has put out a couple statements in recent days that basically says, people said that the vice president didn't have the power. Now they want to change the law, and that's implying that he did have the power to change. What's your reaction to that line of argument?
It is part of the big lie. It continues to be. This president is living in a delusion that he somehow won the last election, and he didn't. He lost it to Joe Biden, period, end of quote. He cannot accept that reality or many measures of reality that most Americans accept.
Are you concerned that the fact that he's tuned into this debate now could spell trouble on the Republican side for
I hope not. I hope not. The good news is it appears that his iron grip on the Republican Party is started to loosen, and that to me is a move in the right direction for that party to become viable and mainstream again.
What's your evidence of that? I'm just curious when you say that.
Just a few little polling results that indicate a decline in popularity for his big lie and his rants.
And could you support legislation that's solely focused on the things in the discussion draft, or would this have to be paired with things like election funding? And
I don't want to close it down. We do so little on the floor, so little debate, so few amendments. I don't want to close down possibilities, but if we could have a core group, a bipartisan group in support of Electoral College reform, that would really be a positive step for this country.
And was the timing of this today to influence the bipartisan group? Was that?
No, not necessarily. We've been at it for a while. I think we felt that we had a work product to put on the table as a starting point.
Senator Dick Durbin is a Democrat and chair of the Judiciary Committee, speaking with reporters on Capitol Hill. Politico writes that FBI Director Christopher Wray is rejecting claims that his agency's aggressive investigation of the storming of the Capitol on January 6 contrasts with a lackluster response to violence and unrest that accompanied some Black Lives Matter protests across the country during the spring and summer of 2020. Speaking in California, Wray offered his most detailed public rebuttal yet to critiques of the Bureau put forward in recent months by some Republican lawmakers and other allies of former President Donald Trump, as well as attorneys for those charged with crimes related to the Capitol riot. That from Politico. Here's the FBI director.
There's little doubt, and we see it on the news every day, that the FBI seems to be sparing no resources to go after some bad actors for the tragedy that occurred on January 6th. Which is a very good thing. At the same time, I think there's also a concern out there in the community that a lot of bad actors did similar things, whether it be to federal courthouses or police headquarters across the United States in the summer of 2020. And can you assure the American people that the FBI is working just as hard to give equal justice of law to those kinds of things that are happening there?
Absolutely. We have one standard, which is I don't care whether you're upset about an election, upset at our criminal justice system, whatever it is you're upset about, there's a right way and a wrong way to express your being upset in this country, and violence against law enforcement, destruction of property is not it. That's what the rule of law is about. So we have, in both instances, opened hundreds of investigations, in both, related to the stuff over the summer and January 6th. We've made hundreds of arrests in both. We've used nearly all 56 of our field offices, including our joint terrorism task forces, in both. We've used investigative publicity, most wanted posters and things like that in both. There are some differences, though. In the January 6th instance, it happened in broad daylight and has been photographed extensively, people's faces eminently visible, and involved the fairly unmistakable breach and entry into the Congress while they were in the middle of conducting one of their most sacred responsibilities. Contrast that from a lot of what we saw over the summer was happening under cover of darkness with people's faces concealed, often attacking buildings that might not be federal property, in some cases the courthouse, but not while people were in operation. And so the federal hook, the federal jurisdiction, is sometimes a little different, and the ability to prove it is more challenging. But we're still working those cases. In fact, just a couple months ago, I can remember a case in St. Louis where we indicted a guy for arson of a gas station during the summer of 2020 stretch. So we're pursuing both. We're aggressively pursuing both. And as I said, we have one standard, which is you don't get to commit violence.
Yeah, well said, Director.
FBI Director Christopher Wray at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, Monday night. He gave a speech, and you heard part of the conversation that followed with the library executive director, John Hybush. Washington Today continues in a minute.
Book TV, every Sunday on C-SPAN 2, features leading authors discussing their latest nonfiction books. At noon Eastern, on In Depth, Georgetown University law professor Cheryl Cashin will be our guest live, taking your calls and discussing race relations and inequality in America. Professor Cashin's many books include The Failures of Integration, The Agitator's Daughter, and most recently, White Space, Black Hood. At 10 p.m. Eastern on Afterwards, California Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna shares his book, Dignity in a Digital Age, where he looks at the digital divide in America and offers suggestions on how to close the gap. He's interviewed by founder and editor-in-chief of The Markup, Julia Angwin. Watch Book TV every Sunday on C-SPAN 2 and find a full schedule on your program guide, or watch online anytime at booktv.org.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast at cspan.org/podcasts, or on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. Russian President Vladimir Putin, writes Associated Press, said Tuesday that the U.S. and its allies have ignored Russia's top security demands, but added that Moscow remains open to more talks with the West on easing soaring tensions over Ukraine. Putin argued it's possible to negotiate an end to the standoff if interests of all parties, including Russia's security concerns, are taken into account. Russia has been denying it intends to invade Ukraine, but there are over 100,000 estimated Russian troops deployed near Ukraine's borders. President Putin speaking at a joint news conference today in Moscow with the visiting Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban.
We analyze the response given in writing by the U.S. on 26th of January, but now it's already clear, and I said that to Mr. Prime Minister, that Russian concerns were basically ignored. We didn't see an adequate response to our key concerns: non-expansion of NATO, the refusal to deploy offensive weapons next to the Russian borders, and bringing back the military infrastructure of the alliance to the status quo of 1997 when the Russian-NATO treaty was signed. And by ignoring our concerns, the United States and NATO in general are referring to the rights of the states to freely choose ways to ensure one's security. But that's not only about giving this right, this freedom to choose how to ensure one's security, because it's only one part of this famous equation about indivisibility of security. And the second part says that one can't strengthen one's security at the expense of the security of other states.
Russian President Vladimir Putin through an interpreter. Russia's security concerns include keeping Ukraine and other former Soviet Union nations out of the NATO alliance and also having NATO roll back military deployments in Eastern Europe. The United States and other Western nations have been warning that an invasion of Ukraine by Russia would trigger very tough sanctions. Some reaction to President Putin's comments from U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price.
President Putin said today that you guys have ignored their main requests, and that's not exactly true. You guys haven't ignored them. You've just flat out rejected them and told them that they're non-starters and you're not going to. So you're well aware of what they are, and you're not ignoring them. You're just saying, no, we're not going to go there. So I'm just wondering if, given that, if you think that there is still an opportunity to resolve this without getting into what the Russians' main concerns are.
We heard from President Putin a variety of things. I will leave it to the criminologists out there, budding, professional, amateur, otherwise, to read the tea leaves and try to interpret the significance of those remarks. For our part, we don't necessarily need to do that because we know that a formal response from the Russian Federation is forthcoming. We heard that again today from Foreign Minister Lavrov. So we have been clear and consistent since we started this process that there are areas where we believe there is maneuverability, that there is room to engage in substantive discussions together with our allies and partners with the Russian Federation on areas where, frankly, we have security concerns. The Russians will put their concerns on the table. And again, in full coordination with our allies and partners, we'll see if there is room to address those concerns. We believe there is. Now, to your question, the response that we provided to the Russian Federation the other day, it did address the points that have been raised by the Russian Federation. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians will agree with the way in which they were addressed. And I think, as you've heard us say all along, it will not come as a surprise to you that there are some areas where we think diplomacy can lead to progress, can redound positively on the security interests of the United States, of the transatlantic community, but also potentially Russia, while other areas are non-starters. And those areas that we've said all along are non-starters. The idea that a country, any other country, can impinge on the security arrangements, the alliances, the partnerships of another country, the inviolability of international borders, sovereignty, territorial integrity. You're right that there is no trade space, none, when it comes to those issues. That should not, and I assume did not, come as a surprise to the Russian Federation or to anyone else as we described what was in our response, because we've been crystal clear about that.
State Department spokesman Ned Price, questioned by Matt Lee with the Associated Press at today's State Department briefing. The White House is sending Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology Ann Neuberger to Europe for meetings with allies about countering cyber threats from Russia. She'll be meeting with her counterparts at the European Union and NATO, also with officials from Poland and the Baltic states. There is some concern that a physical invasion of Ukraine, if it happens by Russia, would be preceded by a large cyber attack. The latest Pentagon assessment of the situation. Here is Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby.
Can you speak to these reports that the U.S. is aware of Russian troops possibly moving medical supplies, especially blood supplies, closer to the Ukrainian border? And what kind of concerns does that raise for the department?
Yeah, I've seen the press reporting on this. Number one, I'm going to stay away from intelligence assessments. I would point you, though, to the fact that we have been long saying that in addition to the combat capability that Mr. Putin continues to add and does continue to add to the western part of his country and in Belarus, he has also, over these many weeks, increased his logistics and sustainment capability. And there's a lot that goes into logistics and sustainment, aviation support, certainly medical support. So we have seen him provide that kind of sustainment capability with respect to those forces. And obviously that does include, field hospitals and doctors and nurses and, the kinds of things you would need to do to be able to medically care for troops in the field. Now, is that alone, all by itself, some sort of tripwire or indicator, or causing alarms to go off that an invasion is imminent? Not necessarily. We look at a whole mosaic of information as we evaluate what we're seeing on the ground there. I would just go back to what we've said and have said now for more than a couple of weeks. We believe that he has enough capability to move now if he wants to. He continues to add to that capability and those options. And he could, depending on what his goal is here and what he wants to do, he could move imminently, at any time.
The Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby, part of his briefing in the Pentagon briefing room, he also said that there is no update on the 8,500 U.S. troops who have been put on heightened alert for possible deployment to Eastern Europe. No update from him. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signing a decree today to increase his country's armed forces by 100,000 troops over 3 years and raise soldiers' pay. He says it's not because we will soon have a war, but so that soon and in the future there will be peace in Ukraine. And the Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov tweeting the U.S. has now sent to Ukraine about 500 tons of defense equipment. A story from Reuters. Streets in some of Myanmar's main cities were nearly deserted on Tuesday as opponents of military rule held silent strikes, marking the first anniversary of a coup that led to deadly chaos and snuffed out tentative steps towards democracy. The United States, Britain, and Canada imposed new sanctions on the military and joined other countries in calling for a global halt to arms sales to Myanmar, a year after Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi's elected government was overthrown. That from Reuters. Myanmar, also known as Burma. In Washington, D.C., the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell calling on the Biden administration to do more to support the resistance.
A year ago, I called on the Biden administration to impose costs on those who stand in the way of the people of Burma and urged our partners to do the same. Along with many in the Burmese diaspora, communities that call Kentucky home, I was encouraged by President Biden's quick condemnation of the coup, the sanctions against two of the junta's main funding sources, and efforts to target individual coup leaders. But regrettably, these well-intentioned efforts have not been enough. There is more the Biden administration must do, and there is more that must be done by our Democratic partners out in the region. The administration should be prioritizing Burma in its diplomacy throughout Asia, especially India. Along with our partners, the United States should expand sanctions to further isolate the military and security forces. We should move to expose countries like Russia and China that aid and abet the repression of the people of Burma. We must push back on Cambodia, which shares the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and indicates they may actually welcome the illegitimate regime to international summits. The U.S. and our partners should also provide more direct help to the representative institutions that are trying to protect the people of that country. This should include direct cross-border humanitarian assistance that bypasses the Tatmadaw, institutional support, and capacity building for the NUG and the NUCC. Look, the international stakes go beyond Burma itself. The Tatmadaw aren't the only ones who benefit from chaos and injustice reigning in Burma. The Chinese Communist Party loathes literally loathes the idea of a functioning democracy in its own backyard. They've been working for years to keep Burma weak and subservient to Beijing, and Russia has found a happy customer in the Tatmadaw for surplus arms. So, Mr. President, 1 year on, the people of Burma are paying close attention. From prison, from exile, from the streets of its cities, they're watching to see which friends of democracy have their backs.
The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell on the Senate floor in Washington. Secretary of State Antony Blinken tweeting, on the one-year anniversary of the coup, we are imposing sanctions in coordination with the UK and Canada on additional Burmese regime individuals, a defense entity, and cronies who materially support the regime. Will continue pressing to restore Burma's democratic transition. You're listening to Washington Today. Shalanda Young, President Biden's pick to lead the White House Budget Office, also known as the Office of Management and Budget, had confirmation hearings today, 2 of them. First before the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, and then before the Senate Budget Committee. OMB has never had a confirmed director under President Biden. His first choice was Neera Tanden. She withdrew her nomination. Then Shalanda Young was confirmed as deputy director, became acting director, and Young formally nominated for director in November. In the first hearing today before the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, the ranking Republican Rob Portman of Ohio asked her about federal spending and it's being out of balance.
Deficit reduction. Nobody wants to talk about it much anymore, but it's incredibly important. And as a percent of our GDP, our debt continues to grow, which is very concerning to me and to a lot of economists who look at where we're headed as a country. And OMB is where deficit reduction should start. You know, that's the entity that is supposed to say no when federal agencies and departments come to you for increases in their budget, and when the entitlement programs are at risk. You know, you should be the ones to, in my view, be the guardians of some fiscal restraint. And so along those lines, during COVID, we had to spend a lot of money, and there were 5 bills passed in the Trump administration. Then, of course, the massive legislation, $1.9 trillion, the largest bill ever passed by Congress, biggest appropriation ever, roughly a year ago. I'm wondering, as we now work through COVID and we have all these programs in place, whether it's time to start focusing on those deficits. CBO recently projected that deficits would be 13.4% of GDP for fiscal year 2022. Wow, that's concerning. So what are your views about that? Ms. Young, I'll start with you. Is it time for us to focus again on deficit reduction now that we are getting to the point where we have put in place huge amounts for COVID and we're making progress with regard to the latest COVID variant?
Thank you, Senator Portman. We may disagree on some of the particulars of the President's budget sent up earlier this year or even future ones, but something this President is very serious about, and I hope you take some solace in this as we look at deficit and debt reduction, is he showed a path to pay for and offset all of his permanent proposals. I worked on the other side of budgets for many years over several administrations. That was a novel idea, that we should offset our permanent proposals. We may not agree on those offsets, but the President did put forward a proposal that did that.
Yeah, well, there were no offsets in the $1.9 trillion. It was done a year ago, and not a single Republican vote. The largest appropriation ever. You're referring to BBB and the fact that the President wants to spend additional money on stimulus, but in this case, he has tax increases to go along with it.
Senator, a version of Build Back Better was absolutely a part of the budget at the time, called Jobs and Families Plan. And you're absolutely right, there were proposals in which to pay for those efforts.
OMB Director nominee Shalanda Young, questioned by Senator Rob Portman at the Governmental Affairs Committee hearing. Also testifying today at that hearing and the second hearing, Nancy Coloretti, nominated to be OMB Deputy Director. She'd take over that position if Young moves up to Director. And at the second hearing, Budget Committee, this question to the nominees from the chair, Bernie Sanders, independent from Vermont.
This is a very unusual moment in American history. People are struggling. The pandemic has wreaked havoc in so many ways, not only in terms of illness, but in isolation, in the nature of employment. People are quitting jobs in record-breaking numbers. So we're really in an unusual place in the modern history of this country. And one of the issues that has concerned me, and I think it doesn't get enough attention, is the growing gap between the very, very wealthy and everybody else. You got two people now who own more wealth than the bottom 40%. And during this pandemic, billionaires have seen an increase in their wealth by $2 trillion just in the last few years. So let me ask both of you, and is that issue of massive income and wealth inequality something that concerns you? And what ideas do you have as to how we might go forward on that issue?
Senator Sanders, I was proud to put the president's budget forward, which spoke to this very issue. 400 billionaires own the same amount of wealth as the 150 million of the poorest Americans. That is why you saw tax proposals from this president that sought to not only pay for the investments in a fiscally responsible way, but also speak to this issue of fairness in our tax policy in this country.
Ms. Colorani?
Senator, thank you for that question. I also support the president's ideas, and as he's put them forward in his policies and in his budget. They aim to build this economy back from the bottom up and the middle out, both in tax policy and in investments in critical items like childcare, which we know will not only help working mothers go back to work, but will also help increase the labor supply in this country, and we need to grow our economy and make it more productive.
Nancy Colletti, nominated for OMB Deputy Director, along with the Director nominee, Shalanda Young, at the Budget Committee hearing today. Questions from Senator Bernie Sanders. TheHill.com has an article that ran this week that began, congressional negotiators are in danger of missing the February 18th deadline for passing an omnibus package of the annual appropriation for fiscal 2022. A shutdown is unlikely, the article goes on, but members of the Senate Appropriations Committee from both parties warned that if negotiators blow through the mid-February deadline, it increases the likelihood that Biden will have to settle for a year-long stopgap funding measure to keep the government open. You can read more at thehill.com. Wall Street today, the Dow up 273, NASDAQ up 106, S&P up 30. From the New York Times, Pfizer and its partner BioNTech asked the Food and Drug Administration on Tuesday to authorize 2 doses of their coronavirus vaccine for children younger than 5, while the companies continue to research whether 3 doses would be more effective for that age group. In a highly unusual move, federal regulators pressed the companies to submit a request for emergency authorization, even though 2 doses failed to produce the hoped-for immune response among children aged 2 to 4 in a clinical trial. Only children between 6 months and 2 years demonstrated an immune response comparable to that of older teenagers and young adults, the standard for a successful trial. The request, which applies to children 6 months to 4 years old, comes as the highly contagious Omicron variant has led to many more infections. The under 5 group includes about 19 million children, the only Americans not yet eligible for vaccination. That reporting from the New York Times. The Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo giving the Senate an update today on how the $65 billion from last year's infrastructure spending law earmarked for expanded broadband access and affordability will be spent. The Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that held this hearing, the chair Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, one of many senators pointing out that one holdup to the money going out the door is a survey by the Federal Communications Commission about what areas of the country need it most.
This is funding that we want to see get out the door. And the timing is really going to be dependent on a number of things, but you mentioned the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, the BEAD program, which is really dependent on the creation of those FCC maps. And the concern that we have in New Hampshire is not just when that's going to happen, but also how accurate those maps are going to be. And I can tell you previous maps that we've seen in our state, and I'm sure everybody has a similar story, have not been accurate. They have not shown where the dead spots are and where the coverage really needs to be. So can you speak at all, recognizing that this is not your direct area of responsibility, but can you speak to what's happening with the FCC and completing those maps? Because so much of what needs to happen depends on when we get those and how accurate they're going to be.
Yeah. So as you say, the maps are vital. I mean, Senator Moran mentioned overbuilding. The mission here, as explicitly laid out in the statute, is to prioritize unserved. At the end of this, shame on us, on me, if there's anyone unserved left. So the maps will tell us who's unserved and who's underserved, and that's why we can't deploy any of this money until we have the accurate maps. As you say, this isn't the purview of the FCC. I will tell you, we are in constant communication with the FCC. I have spoken with the chairwoman myself. I've met with her. Alan Davidson, newly confirmed, thank you, is already in contact with her. We have been, they represent that probably summer, this summer, they will have the maps. I will say this, I do have confidence they will be, more accurate than in the past. The past, they've been broad, by census tract. These are down to the household, and we're incorporating our census data from the Commerce Department into the maps. But for a more detailed answer, I would, refer you to the chairwoman of the FCC.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you, obviously, one of the other aspects of that is what the challenge process might be if there's concern about accuracy. Can you speak to what the department's thinking about in terms of any kind of a challenge process on those?
I think that, again, this really is in the FCC's purview. Our role is take the maps, run it through the statutory formula, get the state allocation, and then run the program. But I think there will have to be some, challenge process simply because, as I said before, we do have to listen to every stakeholder. And it's $65 billion. Like, I've told my team, it's better, yes, you have to go fast, but you really have to get it right.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Senator Jeanne Shaheen, chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees the Commerce Department. Testimony from the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. Today's hearing focusing on the Internet access and affordability that could be provided by that $65 billion in the infrastructure law. You can find this hearing and all the hearings that you hear on C-SPAN Radio in their entirety at our video library at cspan.org. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more of Washington's top stories sent right to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.